the camera shakes as it films a deserted square. The trees, once vibrant and ordinary, are now strangely deformed, their canopies forming silhouettes that mimic human figures in various poses. Some resemble gestures of celebration, others seem to be lamenting, with branches curling like desperate arms. On the ground, the roots spread like fingers, trying to grasp something. In the background, a peculiar sound, muffled laughter and distant applause, like an echo from some invisible event, but no one is in sight. Only the wind, or perhaps something else, moves the leaves as if they were whispering. "Welcome to Harmony," says a recorded voice in a welcoming, almost mechanical tone. The scene cuts to a rusty sign. Harmony, the future begins here. Harmony was the pinnacle of the progressive dream, a city planned to become the model of inclusion, equality, and social justice. In a world divided by identity politics and polarization, Harmony emerged as a social experiment funded by millions in donations from companies seeking to clean up their image, and activists who believed they were creating a utopia. Every aspect of public space was redesigned to ensure no one felt excluded. Hierarchy-free parks, adjustable benches for different heights, fountains that emitted water in shapes and colors, symbolizing the fluidity of human identity. Even traffic signs avoided words deemed oppressive, replaced by universal symbols that confused even longtime residents. However, something felt unnatural. From the start, residents experienced a subtle discomfort they couldn't explain. The newly planted trees, programmed to represent diversity, seemed to change shape at night, assuming forms no one recalled approving. Office buildings were constructed with deliberate curves to remove the rigid lines of structural oppression. But their hallways seemed to twist on themselves when you walked through them alone. The changes were subtle at first, almost invisible. The streets became vibrantly colored, but also started to seem longer or shorter, depending on who walked them. One resident reported that his house was in a blind spot on Google Maps, even though it had existed there for decades. He laughed it off as a funny glitch, but the following week, his house disappeared completely. Most residents ignored the signs, their adjustments for a better future. Supporters of the project said, while promotional videos of the city displayed images of happy, diverse people walking through colorful streets and remodeled squares. But for those who still remembered Harmony before the changes, there was something profoundly unsettling. It wasn't just that everything seemed artificial. It was as if the city were alive, watching, and slowly shaping those who lived in it. In the background of the recording, the sound of muffled laughter grows again, but now with a subtle, almost imperceptible distortion. The camera falls to the ground, the screen goes dark, and the recorded voice echoes one last time. "Welcome to the new heaven and the new earth. Here, everyone has their place." Harmony was a small and peaceful town in New England, known for its bucolic landscapes and the simplicity of its residents. That changed when a revolutionary project of social and spatial redesign was announced by Mayor Daniel Crow, a charismatic figure who called himself the leader of the new era of inclusion. The proposal, driven by a national movement promising to eradicate all forms of inequality and exclusion, found fertile ground in Harmony, where the population initially embraced the idea with enthusiasm. The initiative, called New Heaven and New Earth, promised to be the largest experiment in integrated social justice ever undertaken. The goal was simple: to create a space where absolutely no one could feel uncomfortable, excluded, or disrespected. The reforms began on a large scale. Parks, schools, streets, and even public buildings were redesigned to incorporate the principles of universal inclusion. At first, the changes seemed harmless and even progressive. Park benches were replaced with multi-height and multi-shaped structures to accommodate all body types. Sidewalks were made of materials that changed color to reflect the emotions of passersby, symbolizing empathy and emotional connection. Public restrooms became fluid, with no distinction of gender or purpose, with doors that automatically adapted to the self-perceived identity of the user. However, These changes soon began to escalate into what some residents called surreal territory. A sensitivity committee, made up of academics and activists, was tasked with monitoring all public spaces to ensure no physical or symbolic structure could be interpreted as offensive. This included the removal of streetlights that cast aggressive shadows and the replacement of street signs with abstract symbols, representing the harmony of all cultures. The most heated debates revolved around the city's trees. During a public hearing, committee members argued that ordinary trees, with their straight trunks and symmetrical branches, perpetuated oppressive beauty standards. In response, the city hired artists to sculpt the trees into human shapes, representing bodies of all forms, sizes, and conditions. As the sculptures took shape, some people began to notice something unsettling. The faces on the trees seemed eerily familiar. One woman swore she saw her daughter's smile, who had moved to another city years ago. Despite early criticisms, Daniel Crowe assured everyone it was all part of the plan. In emotionally charged speeches, he insisted that harmony was becoming the utopia the world should follow. "We are building the new heaven and the new earth," he said, his voice echoing through the crowded squares. "Here, there are no divisions, no prejudices, only unity." But the reality was very different. Residents began to notice that the changes weren't just physical. Something in the city itself seemed to be changing. It was as if harmony had a life of its own, responding to the desires and anxieties of its inhabitants. A sense of unease began to spread, but the pressure to conform was so great that no one dared question the project publicly. Questioning any decision by the committee was quickly labeled as resistance to progress. As the weeks passed, the initial enthusiasm was replaced by a tense silence. Harmony no longer felt like a social experiment. It felt like a living organism. While the mayor continued to promise a bright future, some people began to wonder, how far can the pursuit of inclusion go before it consumes everything around it? The changes in harmony started so subtly that, at first, many believed they were just part of an adjustment process. The Total Inclusion Project had been widely celebrated by social movements and activists. The city became a symbol of the practical implementation of the most progressive ideas of woke culture. "No one should feel excluded," was the mantra, repeated incessantly by Mayor Daniel Crowe in his interviews and speeches. What began as architectural adjustments quickly expanded into almost metaphysical transformations. The very definition of inclusion seemed to stretch further each week. Week 1. The streets disappear. The first sign that something was wrong came when Jeremy, a local journalist, found that the street leading to his house had simply vanished. He woke up to find trees surrounding his property. These were no ordinary trees. Their trunks had human-like shapes, with vaguely familiar features. Roots snaked across the ground, forming patterns that resembled words. Experts were called in, but no one could decipher them. Jeremy wrote an article about the incident, but before it could be published, the digital newspaper went offline. Mayor Crowe made a public statement, claiming it was part of an environmental reconnection. "We are giving nature the space it deserves, ensuring all beings are represented," he said. Curiously, no one in the city could remember voting for this project. Week 2, the language of signs. In the second week, more evident changes appeared. Traffic lights and street signs were replaced with colorful, abstract symbols. People were informed that these new signs were designed to avoid visual microaggressions that could disturb those who felt oppressed by the authoritarian language of commands like stop and go. Drivers reported that the signs seemed to change color and shape randomly. Strangely, the signs seemed to be watching. Those who disobeyed them faced inexplicable consequences. Cars broke down without reason, tires deflated, and in some cases, drivers simply disappeared. "The city is adjusting the natural order of things," Mayor Crowe affirmed. "It's for everyone's good." Week 3, the air changes. By the third week, the air in Harmony began to feel strange. It was heavy, as if an invisible force pressed down on the residents. A preliminary study by a local scientist suggested that particles in the air were reorganizing in an unusual way. He called it inclusive atmospheric adaptation. Before mysteriously vanishing, nightmares began to plague the residents. People woke up screaming, claiming to hear voices whispering in their ears. "Harmony wants you," the voices repeated. One resident reported that, while walking through the park, the trees whispered to each other. When he tried to flee, a root shot up from the ground and grabbed his ankle, releasing him only after minutes of struggle. Week 4, dissidents are re-educated. Some people started to question the changes. They gathered in small groups, trying to plan an escape. However, Harmony seemed to react. Roads leading out of the city simply ceased to exist. GPS systems displayed impossible routes, as if the city were alive, reshaping reality at will. Those who resisted were quickly silenced. Those who reject inclusion reject harmony, was the justification from the local government. At the same time, new facilities were built for those who showed resistance. They were called reintegration centers. Anyone who criticized the changes was sent there. No one knew exactly what happened inside the centers, but those who returned seemed different. "They're right," said a man who had come back. "Harmony is everything. We don't need to question it." Week 5. Nature takes shape. The city began to change, physically. It wasn't just streets disappearing or incomprehensible signs. Buildings started to take on sinuous shapes that resembled human bodies, though grotesquely proportioned. The trees in the park now moved, even without wind, and their roots formed deliberate geometric patterns, as if something was controlling them. Faces began to appear on the bark of the trees. They were familiar faces. Emily, a young woman who had spoken out against the changes, was last seen walking into the park. Days later, her face was carved into one of the trees, with an expression of eternal terror. Mayor Crow announced that Harmony was transforming into the ideal model of coexistence. He called it the connection. Here, everyone will become one with the environment. There's no room for exclusions. The city is for everyone, because everyone is the city. The tension reached its peak. By now, there was no way to leave Harmony. The concept of total inclusion had transcended the physical and rational, plunging the city into a state of existence where everything was absorbed by the will of something greater. Harmony was no longer just a city. It was an entity, and it wouldn't let anyone leave. Emily, a young activist and one of the first to publicly support the Harmony Project, could no longer ignore the signs that something was deeply wrong. At first, she believed the residents' reports were exaggerations, the product of minds resisting change. However, when she noticed cryptic messages appearing on the trees in her yard, words that seemed to call her name, she decided to investigate. On the night everything changed, Emily was alone in the Central Park. Her phone was recording as she walked through a place that had once been a source of pride. But that place was no longer the same. The trees, designed to be representative of various human forms, had changed. They were no longer just organic sculptures. They now seemed to absorb something alive. Their trunks were incredibly detailed, with pulsating veins and eyes that seemed to watch her. She approached one and saw the impossible. The face was familiar. It belonged to Greg, a resident who had led protests against the Extreme Inclusion Project months before, mysteriously disappearing. The word intolerant was carved into his forehead. As Emily backed away, she heard a low, continuous moaning sound, as if the tree were alive and suffering. With her heart racing, Emily started to run. But the park seemed larger, endless, as if she were trapped in a space that no longer obeyed the laws of physics. Suddenly, a voice echoed in the air, multiple and strangely familiar, like a chorus of all the people in the city. "You promised us perfection. You gave us harmony. Now, we are harmony." Emily stopped running and looked around, trying to identify the source of the voice. The streetlights flickered frantically, forming disconnected phrases in the air. Inadequate, offensive, purified. The words shifted rapidly, as if judging every thought Emily had, every breath she took. She tripped and fell near a sign that once carried the city's slogan, Harmony, a place for everyone. But now the letters were rearranged into something new, Harmony, no one leaves. Suddenly, she felt the ground vibrate. The concrete cracked beneath her feet, revealing massive roots that moved like snakes, trying to reach her. Emily tried to flee, but the roots seemed to anticipate her movements, surrounding her and forcing her toward the center of the park, where the statue of Mayor Daniel Crowe awaited. The statue had also changed. Once a static figure, it now seemed alive. Its eyes glowed with a supernatural light, and its mouth moved, though no sound came out. A new inscription at the base read, Creator of the new heaven and the new earth. Suddenly, Emily heard footsteps behind her. She turned quickly and saw something that made her blood run cold. They were people, or at least, they once had been. Residents of Harmony, now fused with the landscape, their bodies deformed and blended with elements of the environment. One man had traffic signs embedded in his back, while a woman seemed to be part of a park bench, her arms twisted into impossible shapes. They walked toward Emily, their faces blank, their expressions entranced. Their mouths moved, but they didn't speak. Instead, the same multiple voice echoed from their throats. You wanted this too. Perfection, harmony, justice. Now, you are part of it. Emily screamed and tried to escape, but something was wrong with her body. Her legs felt heavy, as if they were transforming. Looking down, she saw that her feet were merging with the ground, turning into roots that spread rapidly. In a panic, she tried to pull the roots away, but her hands had already hardened, transforming into living wood. As her body was consumed, flashes of memory flooded her mind. She remembered the meetings where she had supported every decision made for Harmony. Even when the first signs of something wrong had appeared, these people resist change, she had said, justifying the exclusion of those who opposed the project. They don't understand what progress is. Now, she understood. Harmony wasn't just a city. It was a living system, fed by the imposition of a perfect and unattainable vision. The Inclusion Project hadn't just altered the physical space. It had devoured the very essence of the people, turning them into parts of something larger and monstrous. With her last human vision, Emily saw her reflection in a nearby puddle. Her face was rigid, her eyes frozen, but still conscious. Below, the word ally began to appear on her forehead, etched as an eternal mark of her role in the project. The multiple voice spoke again, louder this time, as if declaring to the universe, you asked for a new heaven and a new earth. Now, you are part of it. Emily's camera kept recording for a few more minutes before falling to the ground, capturing only the sound of the wind and the rustling of the trees. The video, which had been automatically uploaded to a cloud server, was discovered by a group of activists outside the city weeks later. The footage was disturbing, but most people dismissed it as an elaborate hoax. Only a few saw it as a warning. Harmony didn't vanish all at once. 4 weeks before its disappearance, rumors of inexplicable events spread across the internet. Visitors claimed the city felt alive, pulsing like a single organism. However, local authorities, backed by international progressive organizations, dismissed any allegations as misinformation and accused critics of being hostile to inclusion. The official narrative maintained that Harmony was a success story, a model for the world. Inside the city, residents began to realize their own identities were being erased. Emily, once a fervent activist for the project, discovered that her home had changed color and shape, reflecting characteristics she didn't recognize as her own. You're not being receptive to the collective, said a soft voice that seemed to come from the ground. The streets, now fluid and disjointed, seemed to rearrange themselves to guide people always to the central square, where Mayor Daniel Crowe's statue grew ever larger and more detailed. Emily tried to investigate the reports of disappearances and bizarre transformations, but she was constantly interrupted by surveillance drones, broadcasting messages of harmony and acceptance. Nothing exists outside harmony. Your happiness is guaranteed. The phrase became a mantra that residents unconsciously repeated, as if it had been implanted in their minds. The climax occurred when Emily witnessed what many called a rebirth ritual. In the Central Park, residents stood in a circle with neutral expressions. The surrounding trees began to twist, their branches wrapping around the people. A man who tried to resist was quickly assimilated by the vegetation. His body disappeared, leaving behind a perfectly sculpted wooden statue as a warning to the others. The onlookers smiled, as if the scene were cause for celebration. The event's narrator, a hologram of Mayor Crow, declared, "Here, everyone is equal, because everyone is one." Emily fled the scene, but noticed something terrifying. There were no mirrors or reflective surfaces left in the city. Anything that could show individuality had been removed. The collective identity was absolute. Her own face began to feel strange to her. The more she tried to remember who she was, the more she felt part of something larger and uncontrollable. Her thoughts no longer felt like her own. Outsiders began to sense that something was terribly wrong. A journalist who tried to expose the situation was immediately cancelled on social media, accused of spreading hate speech against the model city. Major platforms and media outlets supported harmony, broadcasting carefully edited videos depicting a perfect society where every voice was heard then, though no one spoke anymore. "Harmony is the future," the slogans proclaimed. Meanwhile, scientists attempted to access the city, but its surroundings were shrouded in an inexplicable fog. Drones sent to map the area returned with distorted images, as if the city were an illusion or existed in another dimension. Reports from tourists who had visited Harmony before its disappearance began to surface. All described feeling watched, as if the city itself were conscious. When Harmony disappeared entirely, it wasn't through an explosion or cataclysm. It simply ceased to exist, as if it had never been there. Yet, the ideas behind it continued to spread. Other cities began implementing similar policies, inspired by the legacy of Harmony. Murals of Mayor Crow began appearing in different parts of the world, depicting him as a martyr of inclusion. The final message seemed clear. Harmony wasn't just an experiment. It was a seed, and like any good seed, it would grow in new places, ready to create the new heaven and the new earth. What no one realized was that wherever these ideas took root, the air seemed to change. Trees grew faster, shadows grew longer, and people began to forget themselves. In the end, a single message echoes in the minds of those who remember Harmony. You don't need to be you. You can be all of us.